Let me welcome everybody. My name is Stephen Blank, and I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's town hall on what local governments should do in response to the financial impact of COVID-19. I'm the editor and publisher of Blank Slate Media, which publishes 6 weekly newspapers and the Island Now website here on the North Shore. And I'm here with Rob Pelez, one of our reporters. We are joined tonight by our expert panel. Chris Wright, a CPA and member of the Nassau County Interim Authority, a state agency that oversees the county's finances. Michael Imber, managing director of Conway McKenzie, and one of the leaders of the governmental, municipal, and educational practices. And Adam Haber, a former Roslyn School District trustee, a former NIFA director, and a former deputy chief of staff of economic development and government efficiency for the town of Hempstead. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining. There's a lot to discuss, so why don't we get started? I appreciate you being here. Why don't we just start off, because we're talking about what we're going to be doing. And the question is, where are we? Where are the finances now of local government, county government? What is their condition? What do they face? I'll let Chris, I'll let you start off, since you you're overseeing the county's finances.
Great. Thank you, Steve. And it's a pleasure to be here. For the record, when Michael was with another firm, he was part of the consulting team that helped NIFA produce a pretty valuable report that we provided to the county with, I think 300 or 400 pages of recommendations on ways the county could save money strictly on the expense side. We continue to reference that as a resource that the county could use. And because, unfortunately, the county has used little to none of it, all the ideas are still fresh, even though it's several years old. It is something that could be dusted off and taken out for a spin and used by the county as the elected officials who actually have the responsibility for balancing the budget, but who unfortunately haven't. And so 6 volunteers can overrule the elected officials and impose our own judgment on the budget. And Adam Haber, I was pleased to serve alongside Adam on the NIFA board as well. So I'm glad to be reunited with them. Thank you for providing the reunion, Steve, and your publication. Where Nassau County sits now, prior to the pandemic, and this is instructive. I mentioned the pre-pandemic scenario. Nassau County, with a minor tailwind on sales tax, because property tax is fixed. It is whatever it is going to be for the year. It doesn't go up or down because the roll is set. But sales taxes are more revenue for the county than property tax, with a slight uplift in property tax and leaving a few hundred positions vacant, during which there were no noteworthy reductions in county services. Nassau County balanced last year's budget. The surplus was over $50 million. And 1% of the county's budget, which is what triggers a NIFA control period, is $30 million. So they balanced it arguably with room to spare, and to the point that pre-pandemic, we probably, NIFA, would have at least had to begin discussions this year about lifting the county's fiscal control period. There are a few things out there that are part of the county's current reality that would have probably kept that from happening automatically. All of the union contracts expired at the end of 2017, and to date, only 2 have been negotiated and satisfied, and there are some outstanding judgments for old tax certiorari liabilities in the hundreds of millions of dollars, but those would be a one-shot. But so the county was, by the end of last year, not only in balance, but in surplus. Now, because the county is as dependent as it is on sales tax, and because sales tax is a function of retail activity, and that was extremely curtailed during, and probably even presently, but certainly in the throes of the worst parts of the pandemic earlier this year, the county finds itself quite a bit short. Sales tax growth is negative year over year. And the county, although that reduction has slowed, and you may see an uptick, you're comping a really good year last year. And so the county it has reported, and NIFA agrees, that the hole for this year will be in the hundreds of millions of dollars, north of 250 million by any estimate. And so there are a number of remedial actions that can be taken. The state legislature, as part of passing the budget, actually gave NIFA some, just to be efficient, they were less precise. And so they gave NIFA unlimited ability to borrow. They simply removed the limit to help the county. So if borrowings are necessary, now they don't balance a budget. Stop me if you've heard this before. Michael and Adam sure have, but borrowed money is not revenue. It never has been, and it never will be. It doesn't balance a budget. It just provides cash flow. But for the county to get through cash flow issues, NIFA could borrow an unlimited amount over the next several years with terms of 20 years or more, which is interesting because if not, NIFA would have disappeared in 2025 when its last note is repaid. Now we haven't done that. So we have that lever, that tool. We are also able, and now that borrowing would require the county legislature and the county executive, who are from different parties and who have yet to agree on this, to ask us to do that. We could grow new debt. We could refinance current county debt at better rates, arguably because of our credit rating being better than the county's. Or we can, without their permission, of our own volition, refinance the 450 million or so debt we have left and move that into subsequent years. And because that's amortizing out at about 100 million a year, it's different every year, but about 100 million a year over the next 5 years, we can provide budget relief to the county. And that would actually be surplus driving, because we take sales tax money and pay debt service with it. And so if we don't pay debt service, their sales tax would go up. So we have some tools that allow us to be helpful to the county as well. However, in the current state of affairs, of course, you've got a multi-party situation and a lack of unanimity there. And NIFA does not have the ability to help anybody raise revenue. We can't raise the sales tax rate. We can't raise property taxes. We can't create the political will for people to do that. And they've shown none of it. What we can do is focus on spending. And so we have, in recent meetings and done it in writing, and I've said so in public meetings as well, recommended that they revisit the Grant Thornton report that Michael prepared, and another report we prepared a few years ago, which contained hundreds of millions of dollars of savings ideas, mostly around consolidating departments, consolidating real estate. And I say that I mentioned earlier that the county's budget at the end of last year was instructive because they were able to not fill hundreds of positions. And I don't think anybody noticed in their level of county service. I don't think people raved about it either way. And so they were able to deal with less, essentially accomplish what would have been accomplished by a plan to organize departments and balance the budget. And so it's possible, and it wasn't disruptive. But what they will have to do is get together on it, come up with the political will to deal with issues that they may not prefer to deal with, and that might require some difficult decisions in order to deal with the expense side of the balance sheet, the P&L rather, because that's what NIFA can work with. I don't know that you can't really raise property taxes dramatically, and you can't raise sales taxes. There has to be retail activity.
Just in terms of framing the issue. Yeah. We also have, Nassau County is not the only government.
No, it's not.
Nassau County has a lot of government.
Right.
It has school districts.
Yep.
That represent 2/3 of most people's property taxes.
Right. In fact, the county is only about $1 out of every $6 of your tax bill.
Okay.
17, 20%, depending on where you live.
And then you have village government,
yep.
Which also represents a share. The
yep.
governor has said that he is going to, if the HEROES Act that's before Congress, or some subsequent legislation is not passed, he has already said they're in the process that they're going to cut back 20% of the aid that the state gives these governmental units. So, Michael and Adam, you're both, Michael, you are, not only do you do municipal government, you do education, and Adam, you work directly, you're with the town. which is yet another governmental, the town of Hempstead, which is governmental, as well as the Roslyn School Board. So how are those authorities affected by COVID and the financial downturn? And what happens what's the difference between us getting some version of the HEROES Act and not getting it? Michael, why don't you start?
There you go.
I'm not quite sure what the differential is going to be for schools getting the HEROES Act or not getting the HEROES Act. What I will say is we all know, especially in Nassau County, that school districts are dependent upon property tax. The thing I worry about is what's going to happen to the future of property tax, and it very much depends on where you are, because there's been an exodus of homeowners leaving New York City, and I live in Fairfield County, Connecticut, and we're seeing a huge influx of people coming out of the city. I don't know if that's happening in Nassau and Suffolk, but to the extent that you're getting a run-up in new purchases, that's going to help hold up property taxes. But there are other parts of the country where property taxes are going to go down because valuations are going to go down, and we're not going to see that for another year to 2 years, and it's going to create a huge crimp in local budgets. So it kind of depends on where you live. The issue for local governments with the state cutting back, that's really going to be a tough one. The state needs to work cooperatively with local government in creating job opportunities. And I'm going to tease the answer to a future question that I think you're going to ask, Stephen, which is what can government do to help reverse it? We need to create jobs. And I've become a big advocate for creating a state-centric works progress administration that would simultaneously address infrastructure deficiencies and put people back to work. I'll give it to Adam at this point.
First, everybody who's on this call, I posted in the comment section Michael Imber's masterpiece, Right After Common Sense by Adam Smith. is his writing of the September 9th, 2011 Grant Thornton report. And I have to tell you, Michael, I never told you this. That was my inspiration to get involved in government.
Wow.
You made me run against Tom Swazi. I hold you completely responsible for that kind of executive run. Because after I read that, my background is business. I've been in finance for over 30 years. I'm very engaged in startups. I'm a principal in a commercial real estate firm. I've run restaurants. I'm fascinated by capital. I like to say I'm fluent in only one other language, which is money. And that report was really well laid out and very thoughtful. And no, not a single idea was adopted. But that caused me to get engaged in government. I could give you specific things they can do, but you should know that bonding is a Band-Aid. We could print all the money we want.
Adam, excuse me for interrupting.
Sure.
I was watching too much of the debate, so it's maybe contagious here. But what is the state right now? Let's look at what's the problem right now. What is the town of a place like the town of Hempstead, which actually made out, got more money than Nassau County, that's a story that we can discuss. But what happens to the Roslyn School District?
All right, so I'll start on a high level and I'll go to smaller government. The county is screwed. Excuse the language, but over the next couple of years, it's over $700 million. That money, both the legislature and this county executive said, we're not raising taxes, right? So that's the standard line, and that's what they think the public wants to hear. So then they can only raise revenue outside of taxes, and I have plenty of ideas about that, but they have to cut expenses. Or they could just kick the can down the road, and they could bond it, and then it becomes a bigger problem in out years. And there's no safety net. So that's the county. The town was in horrible shape until they got that lifeline because of a quirk in the tax law because of the population of the town of Hempstead being 775,000, which makes it the largest town in America, they got more money than the county did. They didn't deserve it. They're no more in need than the North Hempstead or any of the other 10 towns on the island. But they were basically given a lifeline. But North Hempstead, Brookville, Oyster Bay in Nassau County, and several of the large towns in the East End, their revenue is driven from a variety of sources, which has been diminished dramatically. So I don't know what they're going to do. They knew this was coming in March, and nothing has really happened yet. It's reactive, not proactive. The villages are in better shape, mostly because a chunk of their revenue comes from real estate taxes. Yes, some of them have building permits, but you know what? On Long Island, especially in the North Shore, the building's been bonkers. They're not hurting as badly as the county or the town are. But the school districts, depending on where you are in some serious trouble, right? The funding was made whole by the governor when he was going to cut back, but how do you plan for the out years? So a school like Roslyn gets 5 or 6% of their money from the state. The rest of it is really pretty much from homes, from real estate. So they're not in horrible shape. But a school like, if you saw in the news they recently, Hempstead or Roosevelt or Westbury, a large chunk of their funding comes from state revenue, and they can't plan, they can't install programs. You know, who gets hurt most is the poor and the people who can't afford to. So depending on where you live and depending on your government, it depends on how you are, but we know the state's a big issue, but we're talking about local governments. Chris addressed a lot of the county, the towns, and the schools are equally in bad shape. But maybe I'll save some of the fixes for later on in the discussion. But it's not pretty. And bonding, while it may look good today, and that's the answer, it's just a bigger problem and makes it harder to balance your budgets in out years because now you have less money for your budget and you can't plan for that. So you're going to have to cut somewhere. So it's not pretty, and there really is no happy solution unless government is really proactive, and hopefully this conversation will get us to some of those places.
All right, so let me just put a bow around that. When we say not pretty in those things, what are we looking at? You're looking at schools and you're looking at program cutbacks in certain school districts. The county, if they're going to cut back and they're not going to go the bonding route, I know Republicans have wanted to get rid of NIFA for, yesterday. That was one of Jack Martin's campaign themes, was to get rid of it early. So there's not a real appetite for that. So what kind of services get cut by the county? What gets cut by the schools? What gets cut by towns and villages? What do we see happening there? Adam, let's start with the schools.
I can talk about schools, and I'll let Chris talk about the county because of NIFA. But the school districts, it's the extracurricular activities are the first to go. I mean, school sports, then the non-core subjects like the arts and music. But really, 80% of a school's budget is teacher salaries and benefits. So there isn't much cutting there. Once you start cutting back teachers and class size increase, it becomes a much bigger issue. But if schools lose more than 2 or 3 points in their funding, you're going to have to change the way school is fundamentally delivered, meaning class size in elementary schools in the city are over 60 on Zoom. Right now, if you get above 24, people scream bloody murder, but there's no other way to financially do it. Two quick suggestions of what the public schools can do without raising taxes or cutting anything is, one, there's a law that just passed at the beginning of the year that puts cameras on school buses, right? So if you pass a stop school bus, you're going to get a ticket just like a red light camera. Nobody should pass a stop school bus. That could raise significant revenue, and that should go directly to the schools to help offset their budgets. And the second thing is something I put forth when I was first got there. Most school districts have in the millions a budget in busing, right? By law, you have to bus students within 15 miles of your home district. It's just a law. Only 10 districts in Nassau County, about 20 in Suffolk, have their own bus fleet. And we were paying, as a district, about $3 million a year to bus kids to Chaminade or special needs schools, whatever it was. And I'm saying, well, we have our own buses. Why don't we just pick up kids along the way on the route and split the cost? It took 3 years and a huge amount of effort, but we pick up about 10 kids in other districts along the way as of 2019. And we give it, if it was 20 grand, we get 10 grand for that student, and the home district where they would have paid out of pocket 20 grand to send their kids somewhere, they end up only paying $10,000. So we generate 100 grand extra in revenue. The other district saved 100.
Those are some of the savings things that can be done. Let me just ask Chris, what happens to the county if you don't bond?
And I mentioned that bonding was an option, but not the default option. I was laying out our options.
But what happens if I don't? What's going to happen to service?
I mean, the county government's a little bit trickier. The amount of spending in that $3 billion that's discretionary is very low. You must provide police, social services, health and welfare, and other mandated and in many cases reimbursed services. And so what you aren't looking at is, let's say it's a $200 million problem next year, and that's 6.5% of the budget. Those are real numbers. You're not cutting everything 6.5%. You know, debt service has to be paid. Maintenance of buildings has to be paid. And so unless the county is ready to be creative about all the things that we've suggested, all the tools they've been given, about consolidation of departments, the consolidation of services, bulk purchasing and discounts that they can get on that. And also there is some peril in the union contracts that are yet to be signed, but the two that have been agreed to are win-wins. Unless you have that, then what you're looking at is not 6.5% across the board, but you have to look at the services that don't have to be required. And so while you must provide police, you do not have to provide parks. You have to maintain roads to a certain level, but you don't have to fix them to look good, just have to make them well enough. And so you start dealing with the political process, because I would argue that the things that are not necessarily required may be popular. And so, again, you come to a situation where political will on the part of the elected officials who, the last time I checked, ran for office, wishing to do the job, and then took oaths of office having been elected, will need to step in and do those jobs, and not leave it to six, if the seat was filled, 7 volunteers to oversee their work. So you would wind up with entire departments cut, if you will, because some departments can't be. And that's really where and then it'll be tough. It'll be a political process at that point. NIFA doesn't decide what gets cut unless the county fails 3 times, and then on the 3rd try we can impose a budget. But there are entire services that people have come to like and enjoy that might be on the table entirely because you can't cut required services.
Okay, we're talking things like parks,
road maintenance. You maintain it to a minimal level, but maybe you don't fix all the things you were hoping to fix. Beautification, development, anything that smacks of an investment. Although I think we all realize that investments are probably something you shouldn't cut, but if you don't make the tough decisions, you have no choice but to. So, but you are required to deliver police, social services, health and welfare, particularly where they're reimbursed. And in many cases, some of the transportation improvements can be federally funded as well. And then there is, the county, believe it or not, pays for a lot of special ed, even though the school districts provide it. So those contracts come through the county and then are reimbursed out to the schools. So the pool of discretionary dollars, if you think about it, it's been 10 years of the county being unable to get a budget of $3 billion within $30 million of balance, which is 1%. That's why we have a control period. And the budget deficits have been as high as $180 million, and as recently a surplus of about 60. And so the most you're playing with there, and then they haven't figured it out at the $200 million level yet. And now that there's an emergency, there's no muscle memory. There's nobody in public office in Nassau County, particularly on the legislature, who's ever done that or even made a meaningful suggestion in that direction.
So what now? You have 2 options for those of us who have run businesses. increase revenue or cut expenses. We've
Exactly.
just about every business in Nassau County has been faced with that entire option. Some of the government programs that, at least temporarily, allowed some of that pain to go away by keeping on employees through things like PPP. That's gone away even for businesses. But what are the things that, where do you make up the difference in government? Is there ways to raise more revenue? Adam, you had one idea, or are there ways, or are you going to cut expense? Or I guess what's true in both in businesses, you're going to do both. So let's start with raising revenue, which is the easy one, and the politically palatable one. You don't have to fire people when you increase revenue. So are there opportunities that, it's nice with the bus with the tickets, although everybody will be, people are not exactly thrilled paying for more tickets in Nassau County, but what are ways that we could raise more money to offset that?
There are plenty of governments that have underutilized assets on their balance sheets. And the most common one that I see across the country is raw land. Governments hold on to raw tracts of land that probably can't really be developed. They don't have good access to the roads. It's not a nice place where you'd want to build a house. It just sits there. What do you do with it? One of the ideas that I've been kicking around for a couple of years, and I've talked about it with Adam, is create a solar farm, create an energy concession where you, through a public-private partnership or some other mechanism, take this fallow land and give a long-term lease to a utility company that will install solar cells and let that utility make money selling that energy and pay the government a leasing stream for the use of that land. Give them a 50-year lease. It doesn't cost the taxpayers anything, and you're creating green energy and providing an alternative source of energy. More than that, every year we're going to get hit with some storms or some nasty snows, and some of those solar cells are going to be damaged. You just created jobs to replace them.
Okay. All right.
I add a bit to what Michael said, because this is what I spent 2 years in the torture chamber of the town of Hempstead working on, so I'm quite familiar with it. As far as solar farms, I actually put together a proposal to put 30 acres of solar on top of the Oceanside landfill. We had 2 offers of $350,000 a year in perpetuity. It was just using raw land for revenue stream. It was blocked. But beyond that, every landfill on the island is an opportunity to do that. And I know that Brookhaven's done a decent job at that, but many towns haven't. There's a big landfill right here in North Hempstead, which is, I don't know, it's a hot topic, but there's revenue, there's money, there's gold in solar. But as far as energy, I was an energy trader for quite a few years. And I know that you can purchase your natural gas at a discount through a third party, and the county spends, I know that the town of Hempstead spent about $1 million a year. We did a third party purchase. We saved about $150,000 a year just in the town of Hempstead purchasing the natural gas for the town. Probably had a zero on that for the county. Plus, on top of that, most of the towns in the county have dilapidated infrastructure. You can do an energy performance contract and make money by putting in more efficient projects, boilers, lights, a host of things. Every property that the county has as a rooftop is an untapped resource to rent out also. At the town, we had a $7 million positive cash flow project over 20 years in the works when I left. As far as revenue goes beyond that, and this is also piggybacking Michael, the town of Hempstead didn't know how much property they had. So I brought in an appraiser, and we found out we had 750 parcels worth over $4.5 billion. An extraordinary sum of money. Now, a bunch of that was parkland and stuff you couldn't develop, but there was an acre lot that was worth over $1 million, which is dilapidated place to park your boats that used to be in Rockville Center, in Rockaway, excuse me, that was there for the taking. We had about a dozen lots worth in the low tens of millions of dollars that could have been developed. But on the county level, they have 1,500 properties that are in receivership. There's a property called 85 Rogers Avenue down by the water by the airport, which is still county property. It's worth over $3 million. That's been sitting there for well over a decade. The county also has untold amounts of property. There's a parking lot for the town of Hempstead that's right next to Nickerson. Both those parking lots together are over 100 acres. HBO wanted to rent that parking lot out for $500,000 a year to film a series and build a city from the Gilded Age. They have assets and infrastructure they can leverage. And I can go on and on all day about it. You can create a foreclosure registry, but there's got to be a desire to do it. But there is an extraordinary amount of money there if you have somebody who knows how to use it.
So there's money to be raised by selling this property that's not being used by these governments.
Selling, developing, giving it away for free and sharing the upside. There's plenty of creative things you can do to to expand the tax base.
So why hasn't, I mean, Nassau County has been under receivership for 20 years now. And nobody likes it. Why haven't they done this before?
So I'll give you a very quick response, and then Michael's chomping at the bit, and he can say so. In politics, if you suggest something and you succeed, the elected official takes the credit. If you suggest something and it fails, you're out of a job. So there's a built-in fail-safe for you to put your head down and wake up 30 years later and just get a pension and not try anything creative. So people who come in who just really care about improving and get out quickly, they're out of the ordinary and the nest that's usually, there just to put their head down, and there's no incentive to do better.
Okay, you're not encouraging us, Adam.
I have other ideas that will give you hope, but you need a progressive.
We're in the town of Hempstead, and they couldn't get rid of the typewriters in the town clerk's office, so we can.
I agree with what Adam just said. I usually tell it a different way by asking the question, how many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? Just one, but the light bulb really has to want to change.
Okay. So what other ways of raising money, which is the easy way, are there? There's some obvious. Adam has come up with this, great idea over there. Are there others out there in terms of raising money that you're sitting on money that you don't on property that you don't need?
Well, let me just add two other things, Michael. I'm sorry to cut you off.
Please go ahead.
So in business, if you can't pay your bills and you have receivables, you could factor them, right? So if I know I have an approved Walmart wants to buy 1 billion widgets and they have a purchase order, I can sell that purchase order for 98 cents on the dollar. Well, the same thing with a government. The county has over $3 billion in budget. They purchase a lot of stuff. A lot of vendors, especially the people who do the streets, need to make payroll, and they're willing to take 98 cents, 97 cents the dollar to get paid immediately. And there's companies that just started who do that exact thing. They will pay, it's called vendor quick pay. They'll pay 97 cents on the dollar to a vendor, and as quickly in 24 hours, and as quickly as the county can pay them back, they'll share in that discount. So if they could pay them back within 30 days, they'll get 2 points of that. And on $1 billion, that's $20 million. It's substantial money. But beyond that, how you purchase, electronic purchasing is by far and away much better than the current paper bid system. It's more transparent. You'll save money. And they just don't do it. They don't do it in the town level. They don't do it in the county level. It's the old paper, wink and a nod. I'll tell you when this one's coming up. There isn't a great system in place when there are great systems, but the cost of doing business is so much greater and time-wise, and it's disgusted people with the process. Making doing business as easy as possible with government will lower your costs dramatically.
Okay, Michael, you've studied this a little bit.
A little bit. We were talking before the program started that one of the other big untapped opportunities are intangibles like air rights above buildings. There's going to be a whole wave of installation related to the support of 5G technology. And they're going to need air above the buildings. That's an opportunity. Believe that the automobile is going to be less of a personal item in 15 to 20 years. And we're all going to end up in these autonomous vehicles. It's kind of far out in the future, but if there was ever a time to sell government-owned parking garages, it might be right now, and get out of that business. That is not a must-have for government. That's something that's easily done by the private sector. And if you believe in that, George Jetson view of the future, you might as well get rid of those parking garages now while the valuations are decent.
So let me ask in terms of there's this notion, I think Rahm Emanuel said it during the 2008 crisis, that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Is there an opportunity to sort of change the way we raise money? Do you ever consider why not a county, I know this wouldn't replace it, but why not a county income tax to at least partly offset things like property tax and the reliance on sales tax? Is that something that, I don't know if it's a revenue gainer, it would be fairer, it would be a fairer way of assessing people based on not their property, but what their ability to pay is. Is there anything in making a change at this point? Would that be a benefit in the long run or even in the short run?
I think that when you are in the process of considering tax increases, it has to be done in the context of all the other choices and create a whole menu of choices. Just to talk about we should have an income tax in a vacuum isn't going to get very far, because no elected official wants to raise taxes, certainly not in an environment like this when we've still got a big unemployment problem and no one, you're not going to get as much as you think. Illinois just passed a millionaire's tax that's supposed to go part of the way towards closing up that state's deficit. And it has to be voted on this November. It's getting to be a bit of a coin toss whether or not they're going to make it. I think you really have to do a comprehensive evaluation of your revenue options, your expenditure options. It takes, to a point, a conversation with the public. But going back to Rahm Emanuel, who I think may have been mimicking Winston Churchill from World War II, I think that in the middle of a crisis is the perfect time to be making tough decisions. Because when you're up against the wall and you've got to make a decision, that is a defensible move. When an elected official has to answer to the people and say, we were looking at 15% unemployment, we were looking at $200 million deficits in the budget, something had to be done. And this was the right thing. We looked at a whole range of options. This is what's fair, and this is what can be implemented. This is what's feasible. And it takes a certain amount of political courage to do that. Okay,
so are there any other, am I leaving out, when you did your study and presented it to NIFA, was there any other revenue sources? Your time may have come. It wasn't, nothing was accepted, but now you are at that crisis that you just mentioned.
Yeah, I think that when we did that report, we were given a constraint. Tell us what you can do without raising taxes.
Because NIFA can't raise taxes. Right, that's why we focused Michael and his team on expenses, because that's where NIFA's legal authority exists, borrowing and spending. We can't raise revenue or force anyone else to.
are there, other revenue without being taxes? We understand if taxes are out. We mentioned the sale of the property. We talked about some of these creative things that you're done. And we've also come up with some obstacles to doing this. Political.
Why are taxes out? That's my question. Nassau County, we've had a decade of people wanting to run for re-election saying they've never raised property taxes. And there's been maybe one minor increase in that time. Your property tax bill is less than 20% of your total. Every 1% increase is about $8 or $9 million. And we calculated that had the county gone with there's the tax cap, right? Had the county simply approached but not even reached the tax cap every year for 4 years, they would have balanced the budget several years ago, and to be out of the control period today. So I don't know that you take taxes entirely off the table in the county. I think school districts, they routinely re-elect boards of education who have raised their taxes, right, by more than that. But the county itself has not raised the property tax rate meaningfully in a decade. And so there is that there is room there, as much as we can argue that that's an unfair tax system. It might be. I don't think you can, but I will tell you from a budgeting perspective, it's more reliable and stable than income taxes because you set it once and that's what you'll collect. It doesn't matter what people make. So from a budgetary tool standpoint, property taxes are actually more reliable because they're predictable and they can be raised. They just haven't been. But I don't say I think in the county context, villages, towns, and school districts may have raised taxes to the point where they can't plausibly anymore. But the county has maybe once in the last decade done a tax increase. It might have been twice, but in no case ever approached the cap.
Should the governor lift the tax cap?
Well, in the county's case, it wouldn't have to. The cap would be enough to make meaningful differences because they've never done it. I think there you run the risk. Of course, you can't tax your way out of this either. People only have so much to spend. I was just pointing out that for the county in particular, property taxes have not been a vehicle that have been used from an increase perspective meaningfully yet.
Okay. Steve, let me add just some revenue suggestions very quickly, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So the county put out an RFP in January for naming rights and billboards to parks, and there's a lot of billboard opportunities, not huge glaring ones like you see in Times Square, but ways to raise revenue. And I know that one of the submissions suggested that they'll raise over $5 million a year, but it's October and they haven't voted on it yet. So in my mind, that's the loss of almost $5 million in revenue by waiting that. But that's an annuity that could also be bonded if you had to, and you can come up with a big chunk of the deficit versus bonding, rebonding tax payments, which is much more plausible. Any revenue stream can be bonded, but that'd be a good idea to come up with a nice chunk of money. Beyond that, there's an interesting little tidbit. The Village of Valley Stream spends about $600,000 a year on people to collect meters, and they generate about $600,000 a year on meters, right? So they're essentially charging the community money to shop in their stores, but they're not making any money. And if you went to smart meters, then not only will raise more money, but it'll save money from having to have the employees there that you can redeploy in other parts of government when people retire. But the thing that I think is the easiest lift, which should be done in every government, is there's a whole host of auditing. There's auditing of your cell towers, which Michael Limber recently just spoke about. You could sell your cell tower revenue stream. Every cell tower is worth about $700,000 in a sale. They still haven't come to the realization, the market hasn't digested the fact that 5G is coming. And every village has cell towers in their water towers. There's real revenue there. You could sell that revenue stream, and then when you go out to 5G, you'll get the money back. So that's a great way to leverage that. There's something called the foreclosure registry. I helped put it in the village of Hempstead. I spoke to North Hempstead about it. The town of Hempstead rejected it. The town of Oyster Bay is getting about $1 million a year. It's basically a new concept after 2008 where you charge banks about $500 every 6 months to register their homes in foreclosure, and $100 goes to the company that puts it together. You just get a revenue stream of $400 every 6 months. The town of Hempstead could get about $3 million a year off of something like that. There's just ways to leverage your assets that you don't exploit. And having been in the restaurant business, not being able to raise prices, which is the same as raising taxes, you find ways to find savings. And there is an unlimited number of ways you could do it on every level. And I'm pretty sure if the county really put their nose to the grindstone, 8 figures wouldn't be difficult at all.
In terms of raising revenue.
It just leveraging assets like homes in foreclosure, real estate, billboards. I mean, you name it. It's just you can create. We're about to become the Hollywood of the East. We don't have the websites that do in California that encourage you to come film here. Filming creates a tremendous amount of revenue. It creates jobs. And there's no really great database for anywhere in Nassau or Suffolk County. Even the state's database is horrible compared to some on the West Coast, to encourage location scouts to do their business in Nassau County. It could be an amazing revenue source that people will be excited about.
So let me, is the time right? The discussion was some of these things that are smart, there are these bureaucratic reasons for not doing because somebody, if it doesn't work out, they're afraid for their job. Is this a time, is this revenue realistic in terms of us getting that?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Is this the time based on the fact that the alternative then comes to the question of cutting expenses? That's the other side. Right now you've got, there may be challenges of getting people to approve things that would raise revenue, but now the alternative has become pretty grim, although some would say in Nassau County, it ain't, we've been, there's been NIFA there for all these years, so you would think that you'd want to get out from under that by adopting some of these. But is this, is it realistic that people will approve this and adopt this?
Every town and the county should hire somebody like Michael Limber to be the czar. And I'm not being facetious, because he's one of the brightest guys I know. I look up to him in the way he thinks, and his career has been in doing this for government. Yeah. Become a czar, his own office, where they have the right to do like they did in the 70s when they saved the city, and put these initiatives in place. It's almost like a quasi-NIFA, to give somebody, Michael, the keys to the kingdom to make these decisions in an emergency. And that's how it should get done.
Yeah. I would say, I'll also add to that, you referenced earlier the Rahm Emanuel quote that Michael correctly pointed out was probably him paraphrasing Churchill, who I believe said it originally. If not now, for elected officials to find the political will to do something difficult, when? I mean, this is a difficult time. They would have political cover to do things that are difficult. The only, I would say, you point out, I've been NIFA as a board of volunteers. I've been on it since 2007. And you wonder if perhaps, although the members of the county legislature, by the way, whose views interest me in proportion to the number of ideas they've had on the budget in their tenures, which is to say their views interest me very little. But you have a number of elected officials who have railed against the existence of NIFA but done nothing, including easy things, to make it go away by simply balancing their budget. But now would be the time where you think the elected officials might be able to see that this is a crisis, and crises require swift and direct action, and perhaps find it within themselves to make these difficult decisions. And they don't have far to look, because there's 500 pages between two consulting firms of ideas that can save some pretty serious money on a relatively short time frame. So I'm glad you mentioned that, because this would be the year where you would hope that they might do that. And I think the public would respect that and quite frankly expect it of their leaders during a crisis, not to kick the can, not to try to borrow out, but to actually make structural changes that would preempt a future problem and allow them to generate surpluses that build up rainy day funds so that they have money when it rains.
So let's go to, these are smart ideas that the county legislature has managed to resist, I guess, forever. They had the motivation of going nearly bankrupt in the year 2000. Now they've had people like you and Adam to tell them that they're not doing their jobs correctly for those 20 years. That is yet to motivate them. So perhaps, this crisis would, if they don't do that, then the other side becomes cutting the expenses.
Right.
And that can be done at the same time. Let me start off with something that is sure to be one of the most unpopular ideas, but since we are in extraordinary times, consolidation of government on Long Island. Andrew Cuomo ran for governor the first time, proposing all this government be merged. I think there are 54 or 56 school districts in Nassau County. I think there was once a state assemblyman, and he had 12. He was a county legislator. He was an assemblyman, and he had 12 school districts in his assembly district. There's village government. There are the special districts. There are villages. There are sewer. Is this a time to consider? And we know how popular. Nothing was done, and I think, and the epicenter was actually on Long Island. If you look at the number of government, the Great Neck Peninsula has 9 villages. They don't like it when you mention consolidation because they like their local government. But should they consider consolidation of districts? Would that save money?
Michael?
I'll start and say absolutely. When we were looking at Nassau County back in the day, it was one of my first questions. We've got 56 school districts. If you were to say 56 districts times whatever the average salary is for a district superintendent, that adds up to real money if you can just make it just one. And it's not that hard to fathom when you consider that we've got the Los Angeles Unified School District. If Los Angeles can have one school district, why can't Nassau County? And I know that's heretical to say, but that is the level of trouble that we're looking at right now. We have got to be able to consolidate administrative expenses by bringing governments together. The town of Hempstead is the largest town in the United States, as towns are defined, but it's comprised of what? 22 villages and hamlets that roll up into the town of Hempstead? That's a lot of redundancy. That's from the Department of Redundancy Department. So there's a lot of savings opportunities there. And this is what I'm talking about, is that you've got to create a whole menu of ways of saving money. And then when we went through the NIFA engagement years back, it was listing these items as what is it that you must have and what is it that's nice to have. And you don't eliminate all the nice to haves because you want people to live, in your community. Give you an example of what I mean by that and take it off Long Island. I was involved in the Detroit bankruptcy, and I was representing some stakeholders who had their eye on the Detroit Art Museum and said, there's billions of dollars worth of art there that the city owns on its balance sheet. Can we use any of that to, get ourselves paid back? And we raised that idea and people went nuts. Don't sell our art museum. Okay, I get that. I totally get that. They came up with a creative solution that effectively kicked the can of the pension problem down the road for 10 years, but they kept their art museum. So, okay, maybe that one was off limits. And there are probably nice to haves in Nassau County and in Suffolk that are also nice to have that are off limits. But there's probably plenty of other examples where you can do some cuts.
So
And
what are the places then, if we're not going to, consolidate all the school districts or villages, because people consider that to be the essence of being on Long Island. What are other places where you can make gain greater efficiency or cut services that are, what would be first to go in your opinion, in terms of things for expenses, the things that would be nice to have, but in time of emergency ought to go first?
I get a lot of mail from my town, and I would opt out of that, or they should make me opt in. And it's not even regular size, so it's oversized, heavy stock, extra postage type of mail. And we're well into this century, and that would have probably been able to be eliminated toward the end of the last century. Easy pickings, quick savings. So there are examples like that. There are others. You can maintain services. It's like consolidating school districts, but less controversial. And I say that living as I do in a school district where the neighboring school district and mine, neither of them have a post office. We don't have our own zip code, but we have two separate school districts, right? And so I get the consolidation need. But with departmental consolidation, you can, just like you would have less superintendents, you could have less commissioners and just as many caseworkers, right? And then you start looking at the property and the space that is occupied by the government. It's not all owned. Some of it's rented. And once you start consolidating departments, it's no longer headcount. Now you're saving rent. And so all of these plans are laid out. They require department by department, line by line justification of cause, which then justifies the cost, and then allows you to think about how to deliver the same service with the same number of frontline personnel. And you can let attrition and technology complement each other and not have to lay off. But what you deal with is cutting the administrative burden that occurs when you have a department that has an entire infrastructure from commissioner to the level of service. That could be eliminated.
Okay. Adam, any suggestions? You were at the town of Hempstead and you located a number of things that could be reduced.
I could talk about this all day long because I hate wasting resources because they get to be deployed elsewhere. The town of Hempstead has 14, public housing projects that there's rooftop space to lease out for solar. There's ways to redevelop that land and monetize that. But getting back to your question about consolidation of districts, first of all, why does each town and village have their own department of housing? Why can't it be a county or island-wide department where there's one director and it's all overseen by one or two people? That's a great way to get efficiencies of scale and work together. But getting back to school districts, I think one of the reasons why our home values are so high is because people like to pick the district they want to live in. That, as it would sound like a great place to save money, you'd save money 2 or 3 points on administration, but it's not a huge windfall, and I think politically it's just impossible. But the water districts, Suffolk County has their own water district pretty much, but Nassau County's got over 40. Nobody moves to Roslyn or Rockville Center or Long Beach because their water is really essentially from the same place. I think it's the easiest, lowest hanging fruit that would scare the least amount of people is consolidating water districts. And once that's not so scary, I think the rest will fall in line. But that's the easiest for me, and I think it should be happening right now.
Okay. Let's talk about what local governments, I don't know if there's a benefit to this, but governments communicating more efficiently and effectively with their constituents during COVID. I hope that includes using your community newspaper because we could use the plug. Outside of communicating better with us, what do you think in terms of what the communication ought to be? Or how local governments could communicate more cost effectively? I know the county executive had her own hearing the same time the governor did, and she got maybe 40 staff members to watch, and there wasn't many other people engaged. But there are many levels of government. The towns had their own thing. If you had a consolidated effort at the same time every day to give people an infomercial, basically what you need to do and where you need to go and how to get things done, and one resource that people can look to versus everybody, clamoring for airtime, because it was really just a photo op. They cared,
But I was behind the scenes trying to get the PPE to the hospitals early on because I have a background in emergency management with a charity I'm engaged in called All Hands and Hearts. And I try to donate tens of thousands of masks and help the county put that together. And the attorneys stopped that because they couldn't accept donations, right? So there was people were dying, but they were like sticking on form of a substance. So if you create, and when the next hurricane happens, whatever, there's really nothing in place to communicate effectively with your constituents during a disaster. It's ad hoc, and there needs to be something that people know about that's consistent, and it needs to be available to everybody, whether it's on the radio or whether it's via the internet. But it has to be a coordinated effort from every government entity, or it's just not going to be well done.
Let's talk about what happens if COVID goes deeper into 2021. We're having this discussion about all these things. We're looking at, you're starting to see some spikes. A lot of the CDC people who are resisted political pressure, who haven't succumbed to it, have identified the fact that we very well could have a second wave. And there's questions about when there are going to be vaccines, when they're going to be distributed, when people are going to be healthy. What happens if this is third quarter 2021 or end of 2021? It's not done.
Michael, do you want to take that one?
You mean what's the impact on government?
Yeah, what happens at that point when you're doing it? We're looking at today, if this continues much longer, and I know there's a lot up in the air with additional federal funding, but what happens if that's not there?
If we are in the third quarter of 2021 and nobody has made the hard decisions that Chris and Adam and I have been talking about to date, it's going to be a very, very ugly winter next year, because everybody will have regretted not biting the bullet and taking the pain now, which is what needs to happen. We will find ourselves in a position where liquidity is going to be strained. There will be a force on the cutback in services. And when you go through the hierarchy of public safety, public health, housing, streets, you start moving down the budget, people are going to start looking at social services, and there won't be a more important time for social services than right now, and even more so a year from now if COVID persists. And there will be a lot of political pressure to cut into social services. The time is now to be grappling with these kinds of problems. I will move this part of the discussion off Long Island into Connecticut, but there's a member of the state legislature who's a good friend of mine, and we were talking in March, and I told him, you're not part of the CDC, you're not even on the public health committee in the state, but this election in November is going to be measured by body count. It sounds harsh, it sounds terrible, but constituents will look at you and ask, what did you do to help during the pandemic? And this young man has been a phenomenal source of information and communication, and he's done everything that he can do to make sure everybody is well informed. If we find ourselves in the third quarter of next year where we don't have a vaccine, or it's not been distributed widely enough, and we're in the middle of a second wave and elected leadership hasn't made the tough decisions today, I think you're going to see a major turnover in elected officials, which is just one minor thing. You're going to see real human suffering. I worry about homelessness this winter, this coming winter. I worry about homelessness because we've had all these moratoriums on evicting people for failure to pay rent. There have been moratoriums on mortgages, but at some point, the landlords or the mortgage bankers are going to get pressure from federal regulators and state regulators and say, you gotta pay up your property taxes, or you gotta pay the interest on these mortgages. And they're gonna say, well, people aren't paying us. And then they're gonna say, put people out on the street, and we are going to have a real human problem.
How much of, in terms of coping with things, COVID, obviously is an important, the ability to do business, the comfort of people to do business. How much are we relying on, and, we're weighing this discussion about keeping the economy going and keeping people safe. Are there things that, how much of this is dependent upon the response to COVID? How much of it is how effective it is, from the governor on down to making decisions to keep people safe in maintaining revenue and the ability to pay?
Could you simplify your question, Stephen? I wasn't sure.
I guess the question is how well we, how important is how well we respond to COVID? You see, in some places in the country, they don't believe in taking masks, or they're pushing people to go into bars and restaurants, even with the rate up there. How much is sort of the government finances, as well as personal, tied to the response to COVID in Nassau County, in New York State?
Go ahead, Adam.
It's everything, right? I mean, first of all, if we can't agree on whether you should wear a mask or not, we're doomed, right? You have rallies on the East End of Long Island fighting for their rights to not wear a mask. If you don't wear a mask, you get me sick. It's plain and simple. There's no coordinated community effort like during World War II. Everybody shut their lights out, so in case the Germans are going to bomb in the middle of the night, that doesn't happen. It's about me. The anti-vaxxers, they don't believe in the vaccine, even though the mumps and measles and all those other drugs were wiped out by vaccines. They don't trust the government. So between the masks and the vaccines, it almost feels like this thing's going to have to die out on its own, or it's going to drag on. And if it drags on, which it looks like it is, it's going to lead to a very deep and long recession. The government can't print money. The federal government can't print money forever in a vacuum. Essentially, that will collapse at some point. So there needs to be some sense of fairness that unless we listen to the leaders about what needs to get done and work together, I'm not very optimistic, and honestly, it's very scary. So I don't have an answer for you, but the government revenue is tied towards economic activity, building, housing starts, a host of things, permits, and we react as government. We don't do things proactively. We wait till we can't take it anymore, until an elephant's on our toe and it's about to break, and then we decide. And the time to decide was in March. Actually, I wrote an article about this in your paper, that winter's coming, prepare, and nobody's prepared yet. So what's it going to take? I don't know, but I'm not optimistic, and I'm actually not very excited about the next 6 months, because I feel it's going to get worse before it gets better.
We culturally in the United States, if you're paying attention to the economy, you want to hear every quarter, we grew 2%, 3%, we hit 4%, we're off to the races. And I feel like as a society, we have forgotten in the United States that in the second quarter of this year, the gross domestic product fell 34%. 34%. We have forgotten that number. It was only a couple of months ago. We could be looking at something that bad again next year, maybe even worse. But this is the worst economic downturn this country has seen since the Great Depression. And it's no coincidence that I've been advocating to create jobs, referencing something called the Works Progress Administration, which was a tool that FDR used to pull us out of the Great Depression. It's that level. But we look around us, and if we're fortunate enough to be living with a roof over our heads and we're not worried about our jobs, we're kind of caught up in a bubble. But there are people all over this country, and certainly out on Long Island, that are worried about where they're going to get their food. The food insecurity and housing insecurity is a big issue. So this is why elected officials can't just sit on their hands thinking, I don't want to make a bad political move. Human lives are at stake.
So what should government be doing at all levels? And you mentioned one of these things on Long Island in Nassau County, for jobs and for protecting the economy.
What the towns can do very easily, and I had some discussions with this with different town employees, is getting a permit in any town on Nassau County is worse than going to the dentist. One of my jobs in the town of Hempstead was to help people get permits because they weren't getting calls from the building department. If you could create a 6-month build as of right permit granting, as long as you do things online and you don't have to come into government, and are able to build in a quarter or third of the time, like they do in Florida, North Carolina, you'll have an influx of cash. And even during bad times, they'll be development because people know for sure that they could buy something and develop it. If we have NIMBYism in the people who say, don't do this, or government's afraid to make a decision, it gets delayed, like what's going on at the country club in Woodmere, right? Who's going to want to invest here? Who's going to want to risk their capital? If I could build 5 projects in Florida and the same time it gets me to build 1 project here, why waste my money here? So the thing that any government can do, it's whoever has the permitting, it's the villages and the towns, is create a process to get a permit, a true path that could be in a fraction of the time it once was, and I think we'll be okay.
Michael, what about, and Chris, you can speak in terms of the idea of jobs. Right now, unemployment has improved on Long Island. Is there a need to do things that will protect jobs going forward?
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, sure. A couple of things. I would echo what Adam said about the permitting process. Not that I'm waiting for one since April for a pretty minor job here, but it comes back to the mechanical, the IT infrastructure of the town building department that had typewriters and documents that moved from desk to desk and nobody's in the office. I think I'd be happy to write the check for that permit when it's granted, and then the construction can start, and the people who get paid to do that will get paid, and so that the IT infrastructure that enables working from home should have enabled government to operate remotely as the revenue streams would have been protected, perhaps enhanced, because people are home and looking around thinking there's something I need to fix here. The government can also, and has, and I think there was particularly earlier on in the throes of the pandemic when nobody was going anywhere, that was a good opportunity to do, and they did some smart things there. They did advance some road projects that helped maintain employment among the people who do that, but also took advantage of the fact that it wouldn't cause traffic jams in rush hour when nobody was going to work that day. So there are things the government can do that are smart, that promote either revenue coming in, and in this case, the jobs that emanate from granting a permit to allowing somebody to improve their home or their property. And so I agree with that. And I think from a job protection perspective, clearly you want to have an infrastructure that makes people want to, you do have to fix the roads, right? So you can't sacrifice that, because then nobody's going to want to do business if the cars can't get to the office because it's a bad road. So the infrastructure for the county needs to be maintained at a pretty high level to keep businesses and commercial properties happy to commute in our direction and not in some other direction.
It's been a common response across the country in reaction to the pandemic to stop infrastructure projects. And I get it, there could be liquidity issues associated with this, but find a way to get the liquidity. I think if there was ever a time for public-private partnerships to rise up and be more broadly accepted in the states, now is that time, because state governments are keeping their powder dry on borrowing because they may have to borrow to cover operating expenses. They don't want to be financing new infrastructure. If they have that luxury, terrific, go with the low interest rate. But we're already in a low interest rate environment. If you have to use taxable financing through a public-private partnership to get the road rebuilt, do it. But give bidders an incentive or a mandate that they have to hire the local unemployed. And you'll find skilled workers who can do the jobs. You'll have unskilled workers that can do some of the jobs. And to the extent that you've got a deficit of skilled workers, use the local community colleges to retrain people. It's harder to do at a county basis, on a county basis or a city basis, if it was organized at a state basis, a state-centric works progress administration. I actually think that you could really move the needle in terms of rebuilding infrastructure, putting people back to work. And if you get started now, by the time the next Congress comes in, whoever's in charge, if they're going to do an infrastructure bill and they want to provide cheap financing next summer, terrific. But you have to start the work now to get ready and know that you can't count on the federal government for the financing. You may have to do it on your own.
Steve, add one quick thing to that, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So we're talking about reimagining government and how we could do things better, how we could help. I'm a bit of a wonk, as the two gentlemen on the panel are, and the country Estonia has gone 100% digital. 100%, every government function is done online. It's done easy, quickly. You get responses same day. And, you know, interestingly enough, the country of Estonia has got the same population as the county of Nassau. And digitizing as many functions as possible will help people engage quicker, and especially with building permits and other things, and help make government better for the people and more accessible.
Are there programs or services that local governments ought to initiate during this period with COVID-19?
The only thing that comes to mind quickly is just workshops and the digital workshops, like something like this, which is a great forum, on what you do in case you go in arrears on your mortgage. We're going to have a pretty big spike in foreclosures. Information is going to be difficult. If you remember in 2008, people would sell their mortgages and sell them again. You didn't know who to call. That's why I had the foreclosure registry as a suggestion early on. It creates a database of who the bank is that holds your mortgage and who the person to contact is in case it's an issue. Government should make it easy for people to get information on what resources they have to help them if things get difficult, and they will.
Okay. If the federal government, what do you think, let's assume that we had a functioning federal government that was looking to address things in the smartest way. What would we hope for that to happen? We're going to be electing a new Congress, a new president. What would be your desire for, and this, you know, obviously this is a national question, but we're looking at Long Island as well, which we have the state and local taxes. New York City now is now a anarchist center that's not going to get any money according to the administration. But if they were functioning well in reverse, how would you help Long Island if you're the federal government? What would be the best way?
Make liquidity easy. Make it easy to borrow money from Uncle Sam. In the CARES Act, they put together a $500 billion municipal liquidity facility, but they made it so restrictive that now, 4 months, 5 months after they passed the legislation, the $500 billion that was allocated to provide for liquidity for local governments, only $2 billion has been borrowed. $2 billion out of 500. And one of the big fights going on in Congress right now is trying to get more relief. Well, there's $498 billion available, but no one's using it because of the restrictive pricing and representations that elected officials have to make, and the fact that a very small sliver of state and local governments are eligible. All the states are eligible, but you have to have a government unit with more than 500,000 people in order to draw down against that facility. So it's a very limited universe. We need to make liquidity available, and it's got to be done so that people can stabilize, governments can stabilize until we get to the vaccine, get it distributed, and people go back to work. That's what we are bridging to, getting everybody back to work.
Okay. Chris?
Sure. So I agree with Michael. Liquidity for the governments, and in Long Island, for the people those governments serve, repeal the restrictions on the state and local tax deductions.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, we all know what that is, where there's a $10,000 cap.
Cap on, which is property taxes and state income taxes,
Right.
and that would, you know, obviously free up cash for people to spend locally. So.
Okay, we're nearing the end of our time. So I want to ask, you know, what are the important things that can be done on a local level, state level, federal level, to enable us to get through this period, and what changes should be made, and what to best help us get through this. Chris, you're on right now, so we'll let you continue.
Okay. Sure. So, and I'll limit myself to the county where I have a little bit more visibility. The county government at all levels should learn the lessons that have been taught by working remotely, which I think have shown ways to be efficient and effective, and use technology. Leverage reports such as those that NIFA has paid for and provided, and which have been largely unused, and then use the political cover provided by the necessity of crisis to finally make decisions about consolidating departments and maintaining client and constituent-facing services in a way that allows us to fix the budget structurally and not temporarily, so that not only are they balanced sooner coming out of the pandemic, but also can maintain balance in a way that allows the political and budgetary self-determination that should inure to elected officials and not to an unelected control board.
Okay, Michael, you've done a whole report that's been sitting there. Which are your, what are the changes that you would most like to see implemented?
I'm going to give you a very different and unexpected answer, Stephen. I want to thank the people who have tuned in to watch this discussion, because we've been talking about some really scary things. We've talked very fast about a lot of different ways of fixing these problems. And I want to remind everybody of the quote attributed to Margaret Mead: "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." The people who are watching are in a position, as is everybody else in Nassau County, to call up your elected leaders and demand the changes, demand the fixes that are necessary to make everybody safe, healthy, and prosperous.
Thank you. Adam?
Michael, you gave me goosebumps.
Yeah.
Look, I think the counties, county, town, villages, they need easy wins, right? They need to do some things that don't scare people to show change, and not to give Michael another pat on the back. But one of my favorite low-hanging fruit things from the Grant Thornton report was just go completely direct deposit with your paychecks, right? The county still issues, and towns and villages still issue paper paychecks because that's how people want them. But it shouldn't even be a discussion, and the county could save $250,000 just by doing a simple procedural change that won't affect taxpayers and their ability to give services. But on a more global scale, making it as easy as possible to do government business and interact, whether it's adding things electronically. The town of Hempstead added some electronic permitting projects. It took a disaster to make them happen. There's so many other things. Why do I have to come into the clerk's office to file for birth certificates, get a copy of my marriage license? I mean, you should not. Time is a commodity, and if I waste time going to the government and dealing with it, it's less time I have to make money. But most importantly is the counties, villages, and towns need to open up to new vendors and possibilities as opposed to those who've always done business with them, always do things the way we've been done. When you purchase items from a state contract, those contracts are outdated the moment they're printed. When you go out to bid, and you don't get 3 bids for every contract, you only sometimes get 1 bid. You're not getting the lowest possible bid. When you don't renew contracts every 3 years as opposed to just extending them, you're wasting money. There's ways that government can just run more efficiently, spend less money, be more transparent, and then people won't mind. If they think their government is awesome, they won't mind the taxes. They're getting something out of it. They're getting an ease of use. They're getting clean parks. They're getting a place that they feel beautiful and great about. But now's the time to do that. And if I had a magic wand and I was king for a day, the things we're discussing on this panel you put together are things that should all be done. They're not raising taxes or firing people or cutting staff. There are ways we could run more efficiently, things to be creative. And this format has been great, and I appreciate you putting it together. But we all care. The 4 of us care dramatically, and the other folks who are sitting here listening and not one's dropped off care because they want to live in a place they can be proud of. And this is how you do it.
Okay, thank you. I want to thank our panel for this excellent, excellent discussion. We would hope that that our elected officials would be listening in and hearing this message and making some of these changes. So my thanks to Michael Imber, Adam Haber, Chris Wright, for all of those who have attended. We have streamed this to Facebook, so it's available. Tell your friends, promote it. It's on YouTube. We'll be able to give a digital, so if you want to send it as, we should probably lock up the Nassau County Legislature in a room and make them watch this. I think it'd be to their benefit. We'll just kidnap them for an hour and a half and get that done. We'll also it'll be on our website, theislandnow.com. Rob will be writing the story. So I think picking up from Michael, you start with that small group and then hopefully you spread that message. And I think there's been some tremendously valuable ideas. So thank you for taking the time and spending it with us.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. See you.
Good evening.